Okay, so I'm just going to do a real brief Chapter 3 Code of the Street lecture, just to kind of highlight some of the stuff that I think is important in the chapter that may or may not come up on an exam later on. All right, so in the chapter he starts talking about W.E.B. Du Bois, who was basically concerned with reasons why Black Americans were poorly integrated into mainstream systems. So he was looking at this era after Reconstruction, right, after slavery had ended. And he found that Black Americans were not making their way into the lifestyles that white Americans had been afforded in the era previous. So he argues this has a lot to do with the social context of white supremacy, which means that white supremacy informs all of our social institutions. So the value system of the dominant group, white people, is one that is then absorbed and promoted throughout all of society. So he said that, there was a typology to the social organization of the Black community, meaning that there were people within the Black community that were well-to-do, the Black middle class, the merchant class, these business owners. And there were also, those who were hardworking, who might not have been as wealthy, but, they really tried to work very hard. And then there was what was considered the worthy poor, people that followed the value system of mainstream society, tried very hard, but because of a lack of economic opportunities, were left in poverty despite their hard work. But lastly was this group called the submerged 10th. Basically, we'll talk about them in a second. So the submerged 10th were the group that just seemed to be stuck in perpetual poverty. And this is what he saw looking at the Black community within his time period, which is still, an issue today. So when it comes to the submerged 10th, Du Bois argued that they were beneath the surface of economic viability, meaning that, they didn't really have opportunities to get good jobs to kind of provide for themselves within the structures of what's considered acceptable in the culture. They were often described as irresponsible, drunk, violent, robbers, thieves, right? These are very alienated people. And of course, in our modern era, right, when he's connecting back what Du Bois is talking about within the area that he's studying, within Philadelphia, he looks at how deindustrialization and globalization have caused huge structural transformations to inner city Americans who are predominantly minority communities because of white flight and, racial policies in redlining and deeds from, basically the last generations or so. So, with deindustrialization just means that all of those industries that used to provide good factory pay, good union pay, left, right? Because companies realized that they could make more money if they simply sent that industry to another country and had people work for lower wages there. And of course, this wouldn't be possible without the process of globalization, which is where we spread our economic market or economic logic of the market to all things, right? And really, part of this globalization is expanding communication, technology, all these kind of other connections, but of course, industry and, capitalism throughout the world. So, of course, this led to a lot of job loss for people that were living in these inner city communities. As industries left, nothing came back to replace them that also could give people economic viability. And of course, welfare reform in the 90s, which we're going to be talking about at length throughout this class, basically made it so a lot of people that were barely able to survive because of that welfare that made it so they could eat and stay indoors, putting limits on welfare, on how long a person could receive it, having certain work requirements, and having to name your biological father. These kind of things changed the structure of the welfare system itself. And so it made it so that conservatives could say, hey, look, we've made the welfare system better because less people are on welfare. But in reality, less people are on welfare because people have now a 5-year limit on receiving welfare benefits under a process called TAMF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, something that we'll be talking about throughout the class. So, basically today's submerged 10th are turning to the underground economy of drugs and crime because they're not able to get good jobs, right? They're not able to support themselves with public subsidies like welfare, things like that. So since they don't have good jobs or access to good education, and with the only jobs that were available leaving, right, the underground economy becomes that void that picks up the slack. So Du Bois, was really trying to look at how social problems were keeping African Americans from finding jobs. So some of these problems were a lack of education, right? Being put into discriminatory schools, of course, when Du Bois was looking at this, this was more pronounced as most people of color were not educated at all. But of course, during Jim Crow era that followed after Reconstruction, African Americans were educated. But of course, in segregated schools that were given less resources, right? Less money. So because of that, you don't have the same connections, right? Those social skills, those what we call social capital, what we've been talking about, we'll continue to talk about, that are able to get you into the positions where you can get the good job or, you know, get those kind of opportunities that are afforded to larger middle class society. So also just having white skin color, there's certain beliefs or assumptions that come with this, right? There's this idea of credibility. That a white person saying something, speaking on something, is not considered to be, like, let's say I'm lecturing about race, right? I am of the privileged racial group, so if I say that racial discrimination is a problem, people tend to not challenge what I say, versus if a person of color says racial discrimination is a problem, people will tend to look at that person and say, well, isn't that just in your vested interest to say so? Kind of just like how women are maligned for saying that, you know, gender inequality is still a problem. It's like, oh, well, isn't that just you and your gender? It's like, well, yes and no, because gender as a system affects men negatively in so many ways as well. But anyway, so, you know, obviously the skin means a lot when it comes to how we interpret people at a base value. And of course, people are going to develop a certain outlook when they can't get a job, when they don't have any connections, when you basically like a lack of hope for the future, right? So really, this racial discrimination still exists, but it's taken on a much more practical form nowadays. Part of this has to do with an opposition and lack of trust in mainstream institutions, meaning if those institutions don't trust you, then why are you going to trust them, right? So if you know that you're portrayed as a criminal, then you're probably not going to trust the criminal justice system that disproportionately polices and jails people of color, right? And of course, there's some implications here for middle-class Black families as well, because remember what Anderson is talking about is how middle-class Black youth are going to posture similarly to the alienated youth that you're seeing through Code of the Street. Meaning that middle-class youth know that they look more cool, right, quote unquote cool, because I mean that's really what all of adolescence is about, right, is trying to look cool. They will be perceived as tougher, as cooler, as whatever, if they fall in line with almost like the dress code of the Code of the Street, right? So this means that for police, they often can't tell the difference between those people that are actually gangbangers and those people who are wearing clothing or just are other young men, right? And this is a problem too, because this affects their employment, their opportunities, you know, but again, code switching, as most middle-class youth are able to do, keeps them out of some problems. So, of course, you know, working class impoverished Black communities, behavior in public is organized around the Code of the Street. So how you act, how you deal with things. So the fact that if police are not going to protect you, you feel like you have to be responsible for your own protection. So that means that you have to show people you're not afraid to fight. You're not afraid to use violence, right? Because, you know, basically showing that if someone messes with you, you will stand up and do something about it. So everyone teaches their children to stand up and meet violence with violence, because that's what the code teaches everyone, even though, of course, the decent teach their children a different version of this, right? But kids are often, sorry, go back a little bit there, but kids are lured by the street or become victims of the drug trade as a way to get by, right? And a lot of those youth are also decent youth that get sucked in because of the financial opportunities that this world provides. So the drug trade itself is also organized around the Code of the Street. So there is a certain amount of a kind of social conduct that comes into play as to how the drug trade operates. So meaning that violence is employed as a means of social control. So like, let's say, for example, if I'm your hypothetical drug dealer and you owe me money, right? Like I give you drugs on, you know, consignment, or what is called fronting, right? So let's say you get the drugs and then you say, I'll pay you back on Friday. Friday comes around, you don't pay me back. What happens? Well, if I just let it go and I do nothing about it, then guess what happens? My status and credibility as a dealer gets diminished. More and more people are not going to pay me back, right? And my respect in that way is going to be tested. So what do I need to do? Use violence to make sure I get my money back, right? So that's the kind of like thing we hear a lot about with like mob stuff or like gambling, like some breaking someone's knee or those kind of things, right? But this is actually quite common to use some sort of violence or threats of violence as a means of social control to make sure that someone actually pays you back. So in this way, drug culture contributes significantly to the violence of inner city neighborhoods because basically there's this idea that the dealers themselves have to play tough, right? So even if they don't want to inflict violence upon someone, even if this is just like an addict that they know, that they grew up with, that they might care about in other circumstances, because this will affect their credibility. And honestly, this is like your job in this situation. When you have no other means of economic viability, you're basically asking someone to violate their job to help others, right? So violence is really how someone's going to show that they're not going to be messed with. But at the same time, there's this other, he calls the trappings of drug dealers, meaning that to be a drug dealer, you have to have more status in this culture, you have to present yourself as having a lot of money, maybe driving a nice car, having a lot of jewelry, right? Very visually presenting yourself as affluent. So because of that, that also puts people into a significant threat of violence, as we talked about through the campaigning or staging areas, as a lot of people try to lift themselves up the hierarchy by pushing other people down the hierarchy, by jacking them or stealing their stuff or beating them or whatever it might be. So, again, we always have to look at this through this kind of larger structural and cultural standpoint so we can understand how the sociological imagination operates. So the larger culture stresses individual responsibility, right? So we have this very selfish, Ayn Randian, messed up culture, right? And I will blame Ayn Rand till the day I die for this. But anyway, it's kind of ironic that like conservatives are like super interested in this woman, but only because she's saying being selfish is a virtue and you should be happy with that, right? They left out the part where she like was an atheist or supported abortion or things like that, right? That doesn't. Anyway, you look up your Ted Cruz's or your Paul Ryans, they are all huge supporters of Ayn Rand, who basically said that, again, selfishness was a virtue. And it was supposed to be a way to differentiate us from the kind of fear of communism, right? This kind of Cold War era that most of you are too young to remember. I am not, and yeah. Anyway, so, the culture itself is saying, like, if you can't afford to live indoors, that's your fault. Why don't you work harder? If you can't afford to get a good education, that's your fault. Why don't you try harder, right? We tend to put the blame on individuals that are being affected by larger systems rather than looking at how there's a structural inequality in who gets what opportunities. So a lot of people will blame welfare for poverty. It's just super ironic, right? So this idea that drugs, violence, teen pregnancy, work ethic, those are the problems, right? It's often what they call, this kind of mindset that's often used is like the culture of poverty argument, basically saying, and again, there's a great Jon Stewart clip on this, which I love to use, but I don't have the time. But he basically says, like, the narrative in the media around it is, if you weren't such a, and I will, bleep out his bleeps, basically, like, if you weren't such a terrible person, you wouldn't be poor, right? That's really how the culture essentializes it. They say that people are poor because they're on welfare, not they are on welfare because they are poor, which is an actual fact, right? Like, to get welfare, you have to actually go through a lot of inspection of your personal finances and these kind of things. So like you have to qualify. There's there's pretty strict provisions on these things. So this idea that people are like, as they call it, like living off the teat of America, right? This whole like thing, it really comes down to this idea of like who deserves help, who deserves support, and who doesn't in our culture, right? Meaning if we stress individual responsibility, then the idea is, oh, if you're starving, well then I don't care because I can afford for my food. Oh, you can't afford healthcare for your child? I don't care because I can afford healthcare for my child. I had to struggle to do it, so why don't you? Right? That's kind of the assumption that we have here. That's kind of the narrative. But of course, in reality, it's not the poverty. I mean, it's not the welfare that's to blame for poverty, right? The welfare is only like a little band-aid that's helping people that are in this structural situation of poverty. It's really the changes in work, right? The changes in the larger economy and the racist policies of the past that made it so that only white people were able to benefit from the GI Bill and buy homes in the suburbs have caused these huge rifts and inequality in these, subsequent generations. So of course, changing from a manufacturing economy where you could be trained in a specific trade, right? Like Elijah Anderson spoke about it at Cal State Fullerton when he came there a couple of years ago, how his father himself had a 4th grade education and moved them from the South in the 50s and was able to get a job in a Studebaker factory working at what today's equivalent would be around $55,000 a year, right? So having those large manufacturing jobs meant that you didn't necessarily need an organized educational system. So people that were affected by education inequality were still able to get decent paying union jobs if they were, willing to bust their ass for it, right? Because pulling a hot engine block out of a furnace is not my idea of a good time, right? It's not the kind of job I feel like I could physically do. But nowadays we have a service economy and a high-tech economy, meaning that it's what they call the dual labor market. Like, obviously, you guys are all here to study stuff so that you're in the high-tech economy, meaning not in the service economy, because most of you, if you're working jobs right now, you are in that service economy already, meaning that you're working minimum wage and you have a job where it's customer servicey and you're supposed to kiss people's asses, right? The high-tech economy is more this economy where you need to have a college degree or specific training and skills in order to use those kind of new technological resources for jobs. So, this means that having an education is even more important now than it has been in the past when it comes to, these inequalities in jobs. So, as a result of these changes, when all the manufacturing jobs left and what replaced it were minimum wage, fast food, and other service level jobs, this led to widespread joblessness, right? People were stuck in these areas. They couldn't just pick up and move. They didn't have the financial ability to do so. So the poor try to adapt to the situation that they're in, right? And this is when those problems of moral outrage begin to emerge. So we start looking at issues of teen pregnancy and saying, oh my God, these poor people, they're so horrible. Look at them. They don't even value their families. They're not even home with their families. It's like, well, yeah, where are they? They're working multiple jobs to try and survive, right? We're not talking about that issue and why it is that some people are born into this kind of caste system-like, despair of being stuck in systemic poverty. We don't talk about that, how we give them very few footholds out of that world. Instead, we just blame them, like, why are you dependent on welfare? Why are you selling drugs or running guns or doing anything else in the underground economy? How dare you? You must be a bad person morally, right? But really, when it comes down to it, it's more of just a lack of viable jobs that are there for people. But again, it becomes a way to kind of blame the poor. It's like the chicken and the egg thing, right? You're blaming the effect of the economy changing on the people living in these areas who are just feeling the effects of it. Meaning that teen pregnancy is actually a result of the changing economy more so than teen pregnancy is causing poverty in low-income communities. Meaning that, and we're going to get into this way more in depth in the book, but that men are considered to be breadwinners. What happens when you live in a culture of endemic poverty where men are not able to get their status or merit through breadwinning? It means that they don't claim their children. And often there's more women that are either teen mothers or single mothers within this context. Anyway, we'll get to that in a bit. Okay, so when it comes to, jobs, it's very difficult to get legitimate jobs for people that live in these areas. And of course, that's going to, make them feel victimized by prejudice and discrimination. So we're going to watch a video clip about this later, but there are many studies that look at the effect of just how your name, if you have a racialized name, can affect your likelihood of getting a call back for a job. And really, there's a lot of racialized perceptions that happen, especially as management tends to be concentrated in majority populations, meaning people that are male, people that are white, people that are rich. So they tend to hire people that are like them And that leaves people of color, especially poor people of color, at a strong disadvantage for jobs. And of course, if you feel victimized, like you can't get the job, you try hard, and there's nothing you can do, then of course you're going to turn to the only jobs there are, which is drugs, right? So this means that a lot of people don't necessarily start selling drugs because they use drugs, right? A lot of them are doing it just for pocket change, just for an ability to have some spending cash, so they can keep themselves afloat, right? And often more and more younger and younger kids are turning to selling drugs at a very young age so that they can, help provide for their families. So again, this is a problem because part of the culture of selling these things is acting a certain way, being more aggressive, all of those kind of things. And going for bad is part of that, which we talked about with the campaigning chapter, is just, really putting yourself out there as someone who will victimize others in order to raise their status. So part of this has to do with the style of unconventional symbols. I mean, it's kind of funny to call them unconventional symbols nowadays because all the things that he was observing as unconventional symbols then are now completely mainstream, such as like backwards hats or sagging pants or things like that, right? Meaning that at some point, wearing your hat backwards was actually like a cultural statement of antipathy to the dominant culture, right? Nowadays, it's like what frat boys that are white do or something, which is kind of ironic, but it really started as a way to kind of demonstrate who was in the right, who was in the know, right? Who was in the club in a way. And of course, this is a problem because if the style becomes a specific style, that means that, like I spoke about earlier, middle class youth are going to emulate that as well, right? So then the problem is that throwing in people that are actually engaging in the criminal subcultures with people that are not means that all Black youth become demonized through this, right? There becomes this perception that just Black youth in general are criminals. Because people can't really tell the difference between those people who are posturing, just as all teenagers do, to try and be cool, and those people who are actually engaged in the underground economy. So, when it comes to the drug trade as a living, it's interesting. There is a transition for people, right? It's not like they necessarily start out like, hey, I want to get a job in drugs. Let me start that, right? Typically, the common way into the drug trade is really through a neighborhood peer group, right? Like some of your friends start doing it, you start seeing them make money, and then you get curious, like, how do I do that for myself, right? And so the problem though with this is that there's already established drug networks, right? So if someone's already selling drugs and they're making a certain amount of money, or they're selling a certain amount of product in a certain period of time, that typically means they have like an established base of customers. If you just open up shop on a block where there's already a bunch of, established people with established customers, and you take their customers, they're going to either beat you, kill you, use violence against you in order to get their customers back, right? But, so this means that new sellers have to find new customers. So this is kind of where that, narrative that like people are trying to get people hooked on drugs kind of comes from, because there is some reality to that. But of course, the way that it's interpreted in like the war on drugs, like media stuff that we'll be looking at later, is like a much more sinister kind of thing. But it's more that they would have people try drugs, give them a little bit here and there, and then hope that they return as customers. So, of course, this took on a whole new meaning when the crack epidemic hit, right? And of course, so when it comes to distribution networks and social control, there needs to be some way that there needs to be a social control in order to sell drugs, basically. So what's sad is that oftentimes because of these, the drug trade, people die senselessly, right? So like, let's say, a lot of people die as just bystanders, like, just because they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. But those people who get swept up into this and die as a result are often not characterized positively by the community. Often it's considered like, well, like it says here, you're playing with fire, you're going to get burned, right? People don't have much sympathy for those who engage in the drug trade because the idea is, well, that's the consequence. The consequence can be death. So when someone dies as a result, there's not much like, oh no, how did that happen, right? There's a lot of kind of like, well, that's what you get. And that's a huge problem too, because again, without any sort of other opportunities for jobs, a lot of people get swept up into this kind of system. So this is a problem when it comes to these turf wars. So of course, there's different like gang networks that are distributing drugs or selling drugs, and this can be very important, like which side you take, right? Meaning, this is interpreted very widely in neighborhood institutions. So, you know, if you take a side, you basically, it's like tribalism. It's like an us versus them. Once you pick a side, you got to stick with it. And so that becomes a problem because then people within the community that aren't even involved in these conflicts start taking sides. And like we've seen in previous examples that he's given, a lot of violence often comes from that. So some boys are craving the status of being a dealer, right? They want not just the money, but the status, right? Being considered tougher, being messed with less, often getting girls as a result. And the only way that they can get out of this trade is to leave, right? You can't just be like, you know what, I'm good. I think I'm going to stop selling drugs now. A lot of these networks, you have to know a lot of people to kind of get into these networks, and they're going to fear being, you know, ratted out or narked on if you stop engaging in those kind of activities, right? So there's also a lot of situations where people just have to basically leave, which again, if you don't have any sort of economic viability, it's not like you can just kind of like up and move to somewhere. But that often is the only other way to get out other than death. So drug users also themselves engage in violence. This is like a whole nother issue, not just in the selling of drugs, but also people who are using drugs, meaning sometimes people take drugs and become violent just because of the kind of drugs they're taking. We talked about this with chapter 15, right? There's different ways that this works. Some people engage in crimes in order to get drugs because they're addicted to drugs. So maybe they'll go steal things so they can go get more drugs. And, you know, or even in the sale or, you know, distribution of drugs themselves, there's a lot of violence. So these drug users are often engaging in violence, and sometimes they start as victims and become victimizers themselves, right? They get caught up in this kind of system or this cycle, right, of victimization. So they might be young, and, you know, a lot of people that entered the drug economy enter at a very young age, right? And so they might start at a place where they are at the bottom of the ladder, but soon they move up and start victimizing others. So there's always this uncertainty of violence, right? Meaning you don't know when it's going to happen or how it's going to happen, right? And a lot of people that are innocent bystanders get killed and murdered in the crosshair. So an awareness of the constant danger fosters an anxiety among the residents of the neighborhood, right? Because basically whenever the drug affiliated are involved, there's always the risk of violence because the proliferation of guns accompanies the drug trade. And of course, you know, unlike, oh God, I could go off on this all day. Our government doesn't like to do gun death research because then they would actually have to do something about the constant prolific mass shootings. But we know, like actual concrete research has been done, can show that the presence of guns leads to much higher likelihoods of violent death, right? Obviously. So the fact that so many guns are accompanying the drug trade just makes this problem so much worse. What's interesting, though, is the guns themselves have a personality and status attached to them, because the guns that, especially like, let's say you're a young kid in a gang coming up in this drug culture, if you use a gun, it's typically like a community gun, not necessarily a community gun, but like a gang gun, meaning that that organization has that gun. So if you're going to be using this gun, because not like you have money to go buy your own gun, or like the legal opportunity to do so, then the gun has its own personality or status attached to it, meaning the crimes that were committed with the gun before you touched it are associated with that gun. So it's interesting, like let's say you're 14 years old, you're joining this gang, you have this gun on you because you're, you know, planning to go intimidate someone because they didn't pay you your drug money or whatever it is, and you get stopped by the cops, even though you weren't planning on shooting anyone or killing anyone, you were just using your gun as an intimidation tactic. You are caught with that gun. And since it's like a Russian roulette-ish kind of thing, like since you are the one with the gun, it is assumed that you committed the crimes associated with that gun. Meaning if there's like 4 murders on that gun, you're going away for 4 murders, right? Unless you narc on all your friends, which you're not going to do. But anyway, so it's really interesting too. Oh, I should go back and mention also that guns are an equalizer in a lot of ways, right? Not just like what Eazy-E says. It doesn't matter if you're small or bigger. It's this idea that, it really is kind of actually what Eazy-E said. It's this idea that if you don't have power, if you're marginalized, if you're in a situation where, you've been kind of pushed down your whole life, a gun balances that power, right? Meaning you don't have to be strong. You don't have to be whatever. You can just pull the trigger. It's the same, right? That finger motion for any of us is pretty much the same. So, guns themselves can be really equalizers when it comes to, how and why people use them in these contexts. Okay, so when it comes to the actual culture when crack cocaine hit the streets, really, he argues that violence and drug activity is a reflection of the dislocations caused by those larger economic transformations we were talking about. Meaning that the economy is not receptive to the poor, but the drug trade is. So the drug trade is kind of similar to trade schools. So, people that are in these minority, inner city, economically deprived neighborhoods are usually locked out of many working class, occupations. So, for example, my grandfather was an electrician, right? That's definitely like a working class occupation, where the way that he was able to learn was he apprenticed with someone who was already doing that trade. And typically that's how a lot of these working class industries work, whether it's plumbing, whether it's, HVAC, whatever any of those things are. Like I have another uncle that does like elevator repair, right? And he makes bank. But again, it's something you have to get into. Someone has to let you into that club. And since a lot of these working class industries are predominantly white European immigrants or those kind of groups that tend to predominate them. Like, for example, if you have some appliances fixed, and you have someone come over to fix your appliance, there's a good likelihood that that person will be Russian, right? Like there's certain ethnic groups that kind of concentrate in certain working class industries, but that makes sense, right? Because we get people jobs that we know. So if you're like Italian and you have your, friend that's also a plumber that's Italian, they're going to let you in on their trade. But if you're a person of color living in a very poor neighborhood and that Italian guy has that trade, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to help you out because you're not like him, right? You're different. And so that leaves people at a huge disadvantage as well because they're not able to get into those trades that can give you a decent lower middle class financial status, from the working class without that kind of needed education. So, the drug trade itself is similar to trade schools. They teach you what to do, how to do it, and it's almost like an apprenticeship kind of situation, right? And so, for those that do deal drugs, they recognize it as work. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes, those kind of things that a job does as well. And so though it's considered money without work to some people, it really is work to others. Okay, so he uses the example of Alvin and Joyce and their kind of tumultuous romantic relationship to explain how, since this dealer look tends to impress women, why does the look impress women? Well, because they're socialized by the code of the street, right? And the code of the street says that the toughest guy is at the top of the hierarchy. So a woman is going to want the guy at the top of the hierarchy, better or worse, right? So, it doesn't mean women aren't indoctrinated with the exact same logic as men, right? So, meaning that instead of seeing violence as abhorrent or seeing these men as criminals, a lot of young women that grow up in the neighborhood are impressed by these men because they have status, they have power, and guess what they have? Money. And, like he talks about in some of these specific examples, these guys often promise financial support of women in order to entice them into relationships. So many decent youth go for bad because they want to look cool. They want to be considered sexy to those women within the neighborhood, right? I mean, obviously, would it be better for their life to be decent and stay in school and potentially get like a scholarship or something of that nature and be able to go to college and have a better life, sure. But you don't necessarily have that long-term view when you're 14, 15 years old, right? You're not thinking about your future success as a 45-year-old or something like that down the line. You're thinking about, how can I get this other 15-year-old to be interested in me, right? So that's kind of a problem as well. And so a lot of youth will seek employment within the drug industry because legitimate employment is limited, and the employment that is offered is often very low pay and very low status. Okay, so in this chapter, he also talks about this idea of the stick-up. So what's key within a stick-up is respect and alienation, meaning respect because the person that's being robbed has to show the proper respect to the person robbing them. But it also shows a lot of alienation because to be able to pull a gun or a knife or whatever it is on another human person and tell them to empty their pockets in a face-to-face interaction, you have to be profoundly alienated in order to do such a thing to another person, right? It's one thing to like break into a store and steal stuff because that's not a face-to-face human interaction. This is like you're robbing another human on the street, right? That takes profound alienation. So because the law-abiding fear being mugged, this affects what they do, where they go, what hours of the day they go out, right? Like there's certain areas like that are considered those staging areas, like parks or things like that, where people will not go to, or they won't go at all at night, right? Or walk down alleys or certain things like that because they are afraid of being mugged. So this is like that radical definition of the situation within a stick-up, meaning you exchange your money for your life, right? So you either give your money up or you die. So that's like a very radical definition of the situation, like death or give it up. So of course, if you're smart and you know the code of the street, this is really where it's key to knowing the code of the street. Because if you know the code of the street, then you will offer the proper deference or just deference, or you're going to offer the appropriate respect to the person that's mugging you. You're not going to be like, oh, screw you, I don't want to deal with it. Like, you're not going to like mouth off, right? Because you don't want to get shot, right? So it makes sense. So also though, there's a problem with this where the people in the neighborhood have this mentality that you can avoid a stick-up. This isn't necessarily true, right? I mean, lifestyles perspective theories would say it is, but most theories wouldn't say this is actually, or this wouldn't necessarily bear out empirically, right? Because you could avoid it all you could try, but that doesn't mean you couldn't get robbed, right? So basically, there's this idea within the community that if you just don't go out at night, don't go down alleys, don't go to certain areas where the street people hang out, that you will not get robbed, right? But that's not necessarily true. And so the mentality is really just a defense mechanism. It gives people a kind of way to feel like they have some agency or control over the neighborhood that they live in, which they don't, right? So he says that the process of the stick-up itself is almost like a ballet, meaning it's a dance, right? You need the right setting and the right victim. You need someone that's going to be compliant, someone that's not stronger than you, right? Like typically when you're looking for someone to victimize, you're looking for someone walking out by themselves alone, right? You're not looking like, you're not going to walk up to a crowd of like 7 people and be like, empty your pockets, right? Because you can't control that many people. So you need the right social setting, like a area that's not crowded, that's not full of people, right? You don't want to do this like in the middle of a police station or something like that. Like obviously that matters, right? And of course there's a power transaction occurring, because you're literally exchanging money for your life, right? There's this idea that the person with the gun has the power and you give them respect. And if you give them your money and your respect, they will let you live, right? That's the power transaction going on there. So the street knowledge gives you an advantage because you know how to acknowledge power and give props effectively because, sorry, skipping ahead again, because you need to let the assailant leave with their dignity intact. Because if they don't, that's often going to lead to you dying, right? So there's this interesting thing he talks about, this idea that residents in the neighborhood, they see the drug trade, but they don't see it. So it basically means that they understand the economic need for the drug trade, right? They don't want to be victimized by it. They don't want it to be there, but they think that police and local officials don't care. So they understand that a lot of their neighbors are not necessarily bad people for engaging in these industries. It's just that there's a lack of legitimate opportunities for, actual industries that would be validated by society, that aren't violent, that aren't, detrimental in these ways. So, basically, people understand, hey, that guy's broke. He's selling drugs because he's broke, not because he's a bad person, right? And people see it because they literally see drug transactions happening in public. This is why these areas are hyper policed, right? Why? Because it's so much easier. It's like fish in a barrel policing, because you can see someone selling drugs on a street corner. It's a lot easier to arrest them than seeing someone selling drugs within a middle class community, maybe out of like a Starbucks or, out of their wealthy home, right? That's not going to be policed in the same kind of way. So the transaction's happening right out in public. People know it's happening, right? And the street people, like he talks about, are not shy about it. So this is really, again, a larger function of the economic system itself. This economic unraveling in communities pushes people to do things they wouldn't necessarily do otherwise, right? So people in the neighborhood understand that some of these youth grew up, decent-minded, had the same, expectations as other youth, but because of, the lack of opportunities, found their way into the drug trade. So the problem, though, is that it's hard to maintain a sense of community when more and more youth accept the code. It grows in prevalence, and the code basically says that you shouldn't care about your neighbors, that you shouldn't care about your community, that you should only be selfish and care about yourself, and those kind of things. And that's a very negative outcome for these communities. So another problem too is that television largely glamorizes the fast life, meaning the life of like drugs and crime and, that kind of stuff. And so, you know, basically it becomes something that's very common. People see a regularity of violence and death, right? It's something that they're encountering often, very often, between funerals or seeing vigils or, these kind of things. It's so common that people get kind of desensitized towards the constant, deaths that are happening. So part of it for youth, again, is trying to show that they're not afraid of dying, to be tough. So a lot of them actually end up, that's not like be careful what you wish for kind of thing, end up actually dying because they're trying to prove they're not afraid of dying, right? So parents and peers have a hard time because parents are the ones who largely are trying to, positively influence their kids to stay away from the street. But peers, especially if they're street-oriented peers, can be such a strong influencer that can override what decent parents have taught their kids to do, right? So, there's also this idea of fate, meaning that it plays into this idea that the only outcome for many of these poor Black youth is death, right? Like we saw a little bit of this in the film, The House I Live In, where you have people that were interviewed in the film talking about, like, that one guy was talking about how he didn't think he'd ever live to 25. He was told by his mom he wouldn't live past 18. Like, there's this idea that kind of goes around, this extreme alienation and desperation that your life isn't going to be long. Like, you're not going to have a real opportunity. So you might as well challenge that person. You might as well risk your life because there's not much to it in the value of the culture anyway. So violent deaths affect the victim, of course, themselves because they stop living, but this also affects their families in profound ways, right? Like he gives examples of this that we're going to continue to talk about throughout the book. But, some of the violent deaths that affect those families are irreparably torn apart forever, right? Like divorces happen, mental breakdowns within the stability of the people within the family. Siblings have to mourn the loss and go through this kind of world without their siblings there. Like it's a sad reality that it's not just about the person themselves, it's about their families who are largely, forever changed, and the entire community itself, because this becomes such a problem on a daily basis where you're losing so many youth that could otherwise be the people that are transforming these communities, that are causing new innovations, that are bringing in new industries, that give a crap, right? That are able to get out of the ghettoized communities and come back and help people from these same areas. Like, instead they die, right? Instead they're killed because of this drug economy, because that's the kind of world that a lot of youth are forced to be in if they want any status or power. And obviously, that's going to negatively impact all these communities. So when a youth dies, there's a certain process that Anderson noted what happens. First off, the communities tends to vent at police, right? They tend to blame police, where were you, or those kind of things, because often the response times in a lot of these areas are ridiculous, right? Like, I'm going to show you a video clip later on in the semester of a clip of someone in Detroit who called the police and ended up waiting over 6 hours in their backyard all night, hiding in the bushes because someone had entered their house with a gun, right? They called the police and they waited over 6 hours before someone showed up, right? If you live in a situation like that, I mean, what kind of likelihood are you going to have to call the police? What kind of reliance are you going to have upon the police? You're not, right? You're going to assume you have to settle these things yourself. And so oftentimes a lot of people get angry at the police for just basically criminalizing some, but not protecting all of these others. Remember, in his kind of breakdown, he talks about how less than 20% of the people in these areas are actually in the street community. 80% of them are decent-minded folks that are often being victimized, that are the first ones to be robbed, to be beat, to be hurt because of this street community, right? So a lot of residents feel like the police aren't there to help them and protect them from these violent crimes that are taking place, you know, by no fault of their own in their own neighborhoods, right? And so often then community residents develop a bond based on their link to the deceased, like, oh, I knew him from school, or, oh, we were friends since this time, and I've known this guy forever. This is kind of a weird thing when someone dies, where we try to, like, we almost like raise them up to a level that they're not. So an interesting thing of this he talks about is positive memories, meaning that even though a lot of these youth were killed as drug dealers, it's not like everyone's like, you know, focuses on that as much. It's like the elephant in the room kind of thing, where, you know, people all talk about the promise of this youth, or, you know, all of these different kind of things, but they often focus on the positive stuff and just kind of leave out all the part where this person was a violent criminal, right? Oftentimes. So it's really interesting. And often the blame of like what caused this, what can be done, is often put on just this generalized idea of, quote, the system, meaning that people feel so profoundly alienated, like nothing's going to change. Like it's just a systematic issue of, like, you know, something that's just going to keep happening in a loop over and over, and that's the problem that causes all of these youth to not just go for bad, but then to end up dead as a result of that.